I know. In recent days, several extremely important events have taken place, even before the end of the old year. The old year, meaning January 13th. And of course, all of this requires the most detailed explanations. Let's start with this. The conflict between the national elites of the United States of America and the elites of the Western Global Project, who controlled the US Federal Reserve System, has reached an extremely acute stage. It has become so acute that people are now openly saying that the main thing is not the interest rate, but rather the swap lines. Let me remind you, this is the method by which the Federal Reserve finances the central banks of other countries and regions using newly issued money. Moreover, according to American law, the volume of these swaps and the terms on which they are provided are completely classified. No one knows this information. I wrote a lot about this back in the fall, but at that time, this topic wasn't widespread in the West. Today, it has already become clear that this topic is fundamentally important, because without this money, the European Union cannot exist. And the conflict between the European Union and the United Kingdom on one side and the United States on the other is actively escalating. The story with Greenland is a good example of this. Why is Greenland needed? For Trump, it's absolutely clear. On one hand, it's an entry point into the European region. The Arctic region, because Alaska alone isn't enough. Besides that, there are also hints toward Canada. It's important to understand right away that it won't stop there. Trump's interest in Greenland, well, not just Trump, but the national elite of the United States. And there's also another very important factor. This is about the gradual and systematic dismantling of NATO, which has been a persistent and significant source of unnecessarily high financial expenditures for the United States. Let me remind you, there's the Monroe Doctrine. And generally speaking, there's a sense that the United States doesn't want to spend money on the European Union, but they do want to extract money from there. So the speeches of the three main figures in finance, Greenspan, Bernanke, and Yellen, former heads of the Federal Reserve who are still alive, clearly demonstrated what has happened. On the 13th, it became clear that the Western Global Project, its elite, and its financiers will fight to the bitter end. In other words, this is an internal American struggle for survival, not just for life. I won't get into the details right now, whether in the open or closed channel. I write about this simply because right now it's just crazy. But this is a fundamentally important. Here's another fundamentally important point. There is definitely a weakening of the Western Global Project, to the extent that they even tried to take away the main resource. Whether it works out or not is a separate question, but as a result, quite a large number of potential actors who previously couldn't participate or interfere in the process have now accordingly jumped in. And on Sunday, today is Thursday, Professor Evstafiev posted on his public Telegram channel, well, roughly speaking, everyone across the United States who could potentially take part in this game. Maybe some of them won't participate, maybe more will show up, but about 10 players have been identified as a rough estimate. By the way, this made it possible to introduce a new political science term, the Evstafiev matrix, where in the rows, these actors are listed in the rows, and the same actors are in the columns. And accordingly in the cells, it shows how they relate to each other. Because it's impossible to analyze what coalitions might form without having such a matrix. Because if, say, this seventh group and the fourth group have leaders who absolutely hate each other, there's no way you'll get them on the same team. You can't harness a horse and a trembling doe to the same heart. Simultaneously and concurrently, it becomes increasingly and undeniably apparent that there is an extraordinarily massive and overwhelming magnitude of tension from a purely economic and financial perspective. Trump didn't go after Ferris for nothing. Let's note that he did this right after the operation with Maduro. In other words, he was clearly trying to play out this operation in order to use those resources to carry out the Parkson operation against the leadership of the Federal Reserve. In response, he got extremely tough resistance, and then another very interesting story happened. The topic of an attack on Iran came up. The thing is, most likely, Iran is playing about the same role here that Venezuela played before. In other words, it's the kind of point that if Trump gets involved, he's going to have big problems. It's absolutely clear that he can't carry out a ground operation, so he has to bomb, and bomb again. It's also completely obvious that Iran will respond because there are hundreds of thousands of people in the Corps there, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and many others who would be physically destroyed if the opposing forces come to power. These are opposing forces. Again, it's necessary. At the same time, keep in mind that the person they seem to be betting on is the Shah, the son of the former Shah, but he's not the right figure. He doesn't command respect. He's a very weak person, and I wouldn't even rule out that he's just a front and that someone more serious will actually step forward. But in that case, it would have to be someone from the inside, because no one else is known in Iran. In any case, we see how Trump, apparently, having given in to provocation, backed out at the very last second. Unfortunately, pulling off an operation in the style of Venezuela and Maduro in Iran is most likely not going to work for a whole bunch of different reasons. Well, at the very least, because to Tehran, it's a long flight. In other words, it's hard to imagine that such an operation could be done on the sly. Whereas in Venezuela, from the border to Maduro's palace, it was just 10 minutes. In Iran, it takes hours. Next, it's absolutely clear that the focus. Trump wants to put his on Greenland, but they're dragging him from Greenland to Iran. I am not entirely certain that if Trump had successfully managed to do so, in order to successfully execute the complex military operation in Greenland, he would have willingly consented to do it in Iran. And for this reason, I don't rule out that he might be offered a deal from the border side. From Europe, something like, we give you Greenland, and in return, you don't leave Ukraine. You give us money, and so on, and so on. While in addition, Professor Yevstafiev suggested that if the US takes Greenland, they will potentially acquire all sorts of assets, but also gain information about deposits and other things, and more, which would allow them to carry out a very large mission. For my part, I can say that Trump was planning to carry out his own mission. Why does he need the Federal Reserve? Because even if we assume that the plans for developing artificial intelligence and other things are successful, which I don't believe, they still face a cash gap. Success will come in 5 to 8 years, but the money is needed literally in just a few months. And in this way, emission will be carried out, and protection against inflation will most likely be achieved by dumping external dollar assets. In other words, everyone will take a head, but first and foremost, the European Union. That's why it's fundamentally important to force Trump to strike Iran and to reshape Greater Baghdad, the Middle East. That's the configuring. I truly want to emphasize that it is extraordinarily difficult and complex to accurately predict exactly what will happen next in this situation, largely due to the fact that even for a superpower like the United States, the sophisticated analytical framework known as the Yevstafiev matrix remains a challenge. This picture is certainly not complete by any means. There is also the involvement of Russia and a vast multitude of other significant factors. And it is unquestionably and absolutely clear to everyone that these complex structures somehow have a profoundly powerful and very strong impact on the situation. Well, here's a typical example. The hardest hit in Venezuela were London and Beijing. So the question arises, who actually sold Maduro to Trump? Or at least gave their approval, gave consent for Maduro's inner circle to sell him out to Trump? There's no answer to this question, at least not in the public domain. And now, to sort of wrap up, I'll make a few points. Not exactly politically incorrect, but rather controversial questions. Namely, we have a significant number of Russian actors involved. In reality, they're reaching out to certain forces over there, both in London, in the United States, and in other places as well. Let's not point fingers. So, while there was essentially a unified Western global project, it was almost the same thing everywhere. While London was a bit different, but not by much. Today, this is suddenly becoming apparent. This bank here is a bank of Euro Atlanticists. That one is a bank of Trump supporters. And this one, I'm not afraid to say it, is a bank of Hasidic Jews. And this one here is the city. And so on and so forth. So, how will their problems affect our situation? I get the feeling it's already starting to have an impact. For reasons of political correctness, let's not point to certain events that have happened in the last few days. That's the picture as it stands today. In other words, it's absolutely clear that the level of tension is rising sharply. Some people thought that the cheerful new year, following the old one, would bring some calm. No, the level of tension has only increased. Another thing is, there still hasn't been a strike on Iran yet, or a decision about Greenland for that matter. But it is already unquestionably and abundantly clear that for Trump, acquiring Greenland is a matter of fundamental and strategic importance, and it is just as critically vital to ensure it is not tied irrevocably to the situation in Iran. And finally, one question that I asked and answered myself. In fact, Professor Evstafiev. The thing is, even before the new year, sometime in November, the chief rabbi of the main Dnipropetrovsk synagogue said that by January 15th, the issue of the war would be resolved. So that's it. Back then, people laughed at him, but I want to draw your attention to the searches that took place yesterday and the day before among various major figures in Kyiv. I have a hypothesis. Well, actually, it's a hypothesis that was voiced and formulated by Professor Evstafiev. That this is the beginning of a Trump-managed transition. In other words, they want to replace Zelensky with someone else. Naturally, the British want their own person and the Americans want theirs. And in this situation, this information reached Raven somehow back in November. After all, the decision was made by mid-January. Well, let's say January 15th to be fair, to replace Zelensky by mid-January. By the way, I want to point out there were also attempts to force us to do it. I don't rule out that this provocation with the math raid on Putin's residence is connected. It was precisely because there was a strong desire for us to eliminate him. But that's exactly what we don't need at all. What we need is for them to eliminate him. Zelensky, I mean, for them to do it. This is yet another interesting conclusion from the events that have taken place in recent days. As they say, we will continue to monitor how the situation develops. Thank you, happy Old New Year, and goodbye.